I've known a lot of Vietnam vets through my career and my personal life, and there's probably some out there. There has to be that were not shot down. But I have to tell you, I don't recall ever meeting one. All these guys, even if they weren't injured, and there are a lot of them who are Purple Heart recipients, but all of them were shot down at least once, twice, sometimes 6 to 10 times. They were definitely the pointed end of the spear of the American military effort, and they took a disproportionate amount of beating as a result.
An excerpt from today's guest has written a new book about 10 Purple Heart Huey helicopter pilots from Vietnam. Author Colin Cahoon is here, and I'll speak to him right after this break. This is Pointing the Spear. Welcome back. I'm Robert Child. Today's guest is an author of historical nonfiction and historically based fiction, a patent attorney, and a former Army helicopter pilot. He served with distinction as an Aero Scout platoon leader in the 307th Attack Helicopter Battalion of the 7th Infantry Division, where he accumulated over 1,000 hours of flight time in UH-1 and OH-58 helicopters. His current book is called Mended Wings, and Colin Cahoon joins us right now. Colin, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
I was reading some of the reviews. You're getting rave reviews on the book, and I just want to mention one now, then we can get into it. One was from Admiral Thomas B. Hayward, Chief of Naval Operations, and he said, "When courage, guts, and loyalty merge, you'll find Army helicopter pilots fighting in Vietnam, committed to each other beyond measure. This is their story. Buckle up." I love that.
Yeah, it was a great endorsement that he gave us there. And it has been well received. I'm really pleased. I wrote this book to honor the 10 pilots that are featured in the book, and so it's great that the book is doing well, and that particularly the veterans are coming out and saying that they really enjoy it and that it means a lot to them. Yeah,
that's always fulfilling. Before we get into the book, on another interview, this book was a case of your writing what you know, and you were actually a helicopter pilot, a Huey helicopter pilot in the Army. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was a little bit of a journey. I received an Army ROTC scholarship to go to college, and so I started college in 1979, and I thought I wanted to be, like all of us of that generation, the next George Patton, at least the one that was portrayed by George C. Scott. And I was fairly quickly disabused of that when I was at a place called Air Assault School in Fort Campbell, Kentucky in the summer of 1980. And we were trudging through the woods on a march. We got picked up by some brand new Army Black Hawk helicopters, and the doors were open on the helicopters. And so as we pulled up out of this steaming pickup zone, the breeze wafted through the window, and I caught the smell on the breeze of the cologne of the pilot that was sitting in the front seat. And it just kind of hit me like a bag of bricks that when he dropped us off in our landing zone, we were going to march all the way back to our barracks and would be tired and sweaty, you'd be late at night. And this guy was going to fly home to the airfield, get in his car, go to the officers club, and then he'd be in bed with his wife. So I thought, that's actually the job I want to do. So I applied for flight school, managed to get in. And back in those days, all of the Army helicopter pilots learned in a small piston-powered aircraft during primary training, but then you transitioned into the Huey. So all of us were trained Huey pilots, and our instructors were mostly civilian contractors, and they had all been helicopter pilots in Vietnam. And that's, to be honest, where I first kind of got the idea for this book was way back then, was visiting with those guys, because we would walk out to the flight line and there'd be a Huey sitting there, and all the Hueys had been brought back from the war zone. They all had little bullet holes in them still, because when they repaired them, they just put little square patches over the holes. So these were all combat birds, and you'd walk out there with some instructor pilot, and he'd look at it and he'd go, "Oh, I flew that out of Da Nang," or wherever he'd been stationed. And I remember that aircraft, and I thought, wow, these guys have got such great stories. Their story just needs to be told. And then later on, I flew OH-58 Scout helicopters for an attack helicopter battalion, and then after that, I flew VIP Hueys and served in the Army for 5 years. Got out as a captain, but all of my senior instructor pilots, the senior officers above me, were all Vietnam vets. I admired them all greatly, and I just thought that that generation had sort of been overlooked by history, and I wanted to do something about it.
That was one of my questions. I've interviewed a lot of, as you know, World War II veterans, and you've had so much contact with Vietnam veterans. Could you speak about what they're like? I mean, they had not the same reception when they got home as World War II soldiers, but can you speak on the vets that you met from Vietnam?
Yeah, and I think, Robert, that's an interesting contrast, because I have gotten to know a lot of World War II veterans, just through social settings and so forth, and they are a different cat. There's no question about it. And I'm not a psychiatrist. I can't tell you why, but it strikes me that the World War II generation, everybody recognized what a service they did for our country and what a great job they did. They knew it. They were proud of what they did. We were proud of what they did, and they could bask in that, and they rightfully did for their lives. And those that are still alive are still basking in that glory of World War II, and I think that's fantastic. The Vietnam War vets had a different experience, and as is detailed in my book, because I follow their lives from kind of start to finish, a lot of these guys were not respected or admired when they came home. And in fact, one of my vets, when he was walking through the airport in LAX, had someone walk up and spit on him after he'd returned from the war zone. Now, this is a guy who had seen his best friends die, had been injured himself, and had experienced some really pretty brutal things, and he thought he was doing it for the benefit of his country, and he comes home and his country rejects him. And I don't think that experience is unique to him. I think it affected how Vietnam vets present themselves and how they view themselves. And it's only now that we're really starting to appreciate them. But I do think they're different than talking to the World War II guys. They're much more introspective. I think they're a little more reserved. They're a little more humble. I think that's because America humbled them when they came home. But they were all really courageous, strong guys when they set out, and they're survivors.
They definitely are. And you interviewed 10 of them or more for your book. Tell me about the process of the book, because it was meticulous.
Yeah. So how do you when I got the idea, I said, well, let's do a book about Vietnam vets that were injured in combat. How do you go about doing that? And there's an organization called Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association that puts out a publication every 2 months, and I just put an ad in there and said, look, I called it the Purple Heart Project at the time. I'm putting this book together. If you think you have a story to tell, would you go to my website? And veterans did, and there was a video of me explaining what the project was, and had a number of them fill out a form, and then I had sort of a screening process and interviewed a number of those guys. Eventually settled on 10 veterans, and their stories span the entire Vietnam War. The first guy, Chapter 1, was injured in 1966, so the war's really taking off. And then the last guy was injured towards the end of 1972, when the only Americans left in Vietnam were really pilots, because all of the ground forces had gone home. So once I had these 10 guys identified, I set out to write a chapter on each one. And that required, first of all, interviews. And, you talk about the different generational differences. The Vietnam era generation, it's a phone generation. And so they're actually more comfortable talking on the phone, I think, than anything else. And so I did between 6 and 12 hours of telephone interviews with each vet, and then I did as much research as I could through other sources about their units, the action they were in, anything I could find out about them. There's an amazing amount of things you can find out online nowadays. You can just about get anybody's high school annual, which kind of helps get information. And interviewed some of the family members for some of the chapters, and friends, if I could track down friends. And so every chapter took a lot of research. I wanted to get it as factually accurate as I could, and then I put it together, send it to the vet, and say, what do you think? How'd we do? And we would take it from there. So that was kind of the process.
We'll be back to the conversation after this quick break.
World War II was the most violent and destructive armed conflict in the history of mankind. Thousands of books, films, and memorials have been dedicated to the conflict. Yet one unwritten and unheralded chapter remains. The story of America's World War II glider pilots, spearheading nearly every Allied assault during the war.
Oh, I have the greatest respect and admiration for the guys who sat there in the pilot seat of those gliders.
Because there was such a small group of us and so many men under arms, it made us feel that we were kind of special. Chip on the shoulder, don't fool with us, we're glider pilots.
The largest armed conflict in human history demanded all an individual soldier could possibly muster. And the American glider pilots were among the bravest individual soldiers serving on the Allied lines. While many glider veterans will humbly tell you that they were simply doing their part, they will add that the G on their wings did not stand for glider. It stood for guts.
Silent Wings, the American glider pilots of World War II, narrated by Hal Holbrook, and available on Amazon Prime. Now back to my conversation with Colin Cahoon. So you sent them a copy of the chapters before you sent it to your publisher?
Yes, and the reason I did that is because I wanted to, they were technically, each one was technically under contract with me. And by the letter of the contract, once they gave me their story, it was mine. I could do whatever I wanted to with it. But I didn't think that, I wanted to make sure they were bought in on how I presented their lives. I didn't think it was fair for them to share those kind of details and then not have a say in whether we got it right, and on occasion whether certain facts should be included or not included, because some of this is very painful stuff for them. So I would send them a chapter and I'd say, read it, digest it, share it with your wife, call me back, let me know what you think. And some of these, for a lot of these guys, it was like ripping a scab off, and I wouldn't hear from them for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, sometimes 2 months. And then I'd finally get a call back, and they would say, Colin, you did a great job. You absolutely nailed my story, and I'm sorry it took me a while to call you back, but just to relive it from start to finish in this way it was very difficult, and it took me a while to be able to give you my thoughts on it. And then some of the guys, like I said, they shared very intimate details that they had never disclosed to anyone before, even their wives or children. And so sometimes we'd have to have a discussion about that. They'd say, look, do we need to include this in the book? I'm very uncomfortable about telling the world this. And I would try to work with them in that regard, and I'd point out that you went through this, it's very painful, but you're doing this not only for yourself, but you're doing this for your brother pilots who went through the same thing, and nobody ever realizes what this was like. And so a lot of times they'd say, yeah, that's a reason to tell it, and they'd leave it in. which I'm very honored that they trusted me to present that to the world for them.
It sounds like, I'm going to read it, but it sounds like an emotional read, like a roller coaster almost. A lot of Vietnam War stories are, but it sounds like a real roller coaster to me of emotions, the book.
I think it is, and when I set out to write this, for some reason, I had no idea where it was going to take me, but I kind of had this idea that, well, it's 10 Purple Heart guys, they're all injured. Their stories are kind of going to be kind of the same. And that was sort of the biggest revelation, is just how radically different every single one of these chapters turned out. And some of these guys were just brutally, badly mauled in combat. The paraplegic or brain damage, those kind of things. And so you learn how that affected them, how they struggled with it when they got back, how they overcame it, and how ultimately they believed they were victorious and survived and won and are happy and proud of their lives. And some of the guys were not hurt quite so bad, but it's almost the ones that weren't hurt as bad suffered the more psychological injuries. It was, I think it was seeing their friends killed and badly hurt, and then they had an injury that maybe they're in the hospital for 3 or 4 weeks, and then they're out, and they're just thinking, why did I get off so easy? Why didn't I suffer as badly as my friends did?
Yeah, that survivor guilt. And in the other interview I listened to, you quoted the casualty figures of pilots, and they were higher than the infantry. Is that correct? Or they were higher in number than you would expect?
As a percentage of casualties, helicopter pilot casualties were really the only occupation in Vietnam that probably came close to how dangerous a helicopter pilot's vocation was in that war zone were infantry lieutenants or lieutenants who are leading patrols and platoon-sized elements into the bush. And that's because they were very highly prized targets, and they always had a guy with a big, long antenna, with a radio standing next to him, so they're easy to spot. But, I've known a lot of Vietnam vets through my career and my personal life, and there's probably some out there has to be, that were not shot down. But I have to tell you, I don't recall ever meeting one. All these guys, even if they weren't injured, and there are a lot of them who are Purple Heart recipients, but all of them were shot down at least once, twice, sometimes 6 to 10 times during just a 1-year tour in Vietnam. And it was an extremely dangerous vocation. You see the images of the Hueys slowing down to go into a landing zone where they're pretty much just sitting ducks, as they slow down and have to land and let the troops out or come back out. But also you look at the scout pilots who were basically trackers, and they were flying down so low that they could tell the difference between whether there was muddy water in a footprint or clear water, which would tell them how long that track had been there, and flying up to the mouths of these little spider holes and peeking in through their chin bubbles to see if they can see a pair of eyes popping back out, and hopefully there won't be a gun pointing out that's going to injure them. But they were definitely the pointed end of the spear of the American military effort, and they took a disproportionate amount of beating as a result.
Well, it's just a fascinating story to me, and I know this is your first nonfiction book. Are you gonna? You have 2 other historical fiction books about stories surrounding World War I, but are you going to stick with nonfiction? That's
a really good question, Robert. The first 2 books, The Man with the Black Box and Charlie Calling, were historical fiction and were originally intended as a trilogy. And so there's a third book to be written in that regard, and I've started writing that so I can finish that series. I stepped out of phase to do Mended Wings just because I felt like now was the time to do it. We've got to get these stories down while this generation is still around and can still see themselves being honored in print, and while they're still around to tell their stories. So to answer your question, the next book in queue is historical fiction. After that, I've got, this sounds absurd, but I probably have about a dozen to 15 book proposals in the queue, and fortunately I'll be around long enough to get to all of them that I presently hope to write. But it was nice to get the third one in the can. Yeah,
you get up some momentum, and you build up your repertoire and your name, and it's all it's a marathon, not a sprint. That's for sure. The book is called Mended Wings by Colin Cahoon. Colin, thank you so much for joining us. This was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you for being here. Thank you, and I appreciate you highlighting this book and the men that served our country so valiantly. I appreciate it, Robert. You bet. That's it for this episode. Thanks again for joining me. Next time, my guest will be Dr. Tony Brooks, author of Leave No Man Behind, the untold story of the Rangers' unrelenting search for Marcus Luttrell, a Navy SEAL lone survivor in Afghanistan.
Just less than 24 hours before we were on that helicopter, we knew we lost a helicopter that was carrying 16 men. So we were expecting the worst, and we were angry. Who dare attack us? That was our thought. And this time it was really close to home in the special operations community. We were pretty pissed off. We were ready to fight. That's next time. And you can stay up to date with all the upcoming guests. Just sign up for my bi-monthly newsletter at my website, robchild.net. I'm Robert Child, and this has been Point of the Spear.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.
I wanted to take a moment to thank our growing army of listener-supported members. You make it possible to continue our mission of bringing you the best military history authors, filmmakers, and movers and shakers. If you're not a member yet, it's easy to join. It just takes seconds. Scroll down to the bottom of this episode's description and click the support link. You'll come to our anchor page, click the support button, then complete the brief form. It's that easy. We're planning loyalty perks and giveaways to roll out over the coming months for our early supporters who sign on before the end of the year. So don't wait. Become a member today, and thank you for your support.